Hello everyone, I'm Weiqiao Fan from Shanghai Normal University, Shanghai, China. Today's my topic is for the Big Five plus interpersonal relatedness in China. As we know, Big Five model is a very popular personality model and has been supported across culturally. However, because the Big Five model mainly derived from the Western cultures, so when it has been used in non-Western cultures, some imposed ethical deficits of factors has been questioned. Maybe openness factor is a very good example for this situation. For example, we found both its subscales and the whole factors alpha coefficient is very low. Sometimes only 0.1. Sometimes generally is no more than 0.5. Actually, similar results were obtained in other studies in Asia and Europe. So even though the openness factor was retrieved in the factor analysis in the Chinese setting, some of its phases did not load well on the factor. Also, some of the openness phases are relevant across cultures. There are variations in the configuration of these phases in the nomological network of personality constructs in different cultures. Even if similar factor structures can be forged in different cultures, the imposed approach may be akin to the Chinese idiom of cutting one's toes to fit the soles. So our research team began to reflect our long-term objectives. Instead of making adjustments to norms and test interpretations of imported tests based on cross-cultural difference, we developed a personality inventory. It's named the Cross-Cultural Chinese Personality Assessment Inventory. It's grounded in the local cultural context for Chinese people. Up to now, we have 3 versions for this inventory. The first version, CPAI 1, is for adulthood. CPAI 2 is revised based on CPAI and is also for adult population. In 2008, we also developed adolescent version, as we call it CPAI adolescent, CPAI. It's generally in the CPAI inventory. It includes 4 factors. One is social potency or expansiveness. Second is dependability. Third is accommodation. The last one is a cultural specific factor. We call it interpersonal relatedness. There are the item sources for CPAI inventory. Popular contemporary Chinese novels written by authors in Chinese societies. It may reflect Chinese scholars how to describe Chinese personality. We also refer to some books on the Chinese proverbs that included attitudes and behaviors describing personality. Also refers to statements of self-descriptions collected by students in a formal street survey in Hong Kong. We also made some pilot studies in Hong Kong and mainland China, including teachers, doctors, nurses, social workers, psychologists, and business managers. We also refer to psychological literature identifying unique personality constructs in the Chinese cultures. When we have the CPAI inventory, we made some joint factor analysis with the Big Five model. For example, in 2001, this paper is for the joint factor analysis between CPAI and the CPAI 1 and the NEO Big Five model. We found none of the Big Five scales loaded on the CPAI IR factor. We also found none of CPAI scales loaded on the NEO openness factor. These results were replicated in the study in Singapore using the English version of CPAI. This may be reflected. The IR factor might be considered a cultural specific dimension of personality in Chinese culture. As for IR factor, it's evaluating the characteristics associated with the relationship between people, including society, family, and relatives in the personality structure. It's not only the connotation of how to behave in the world, such as being a person, being a good person, but also including the elements of personality traits that are related to interpersonal psychological intimacy. Because given the absence of openness factor in the original CPAI when we compared with the Big Five model, our research team considered whether there was a major gap in our conceptualization of personality structure with Western people. Openness was not included as a salient construct in other indigenous studies of Chinese personality, but made some indigenous constructs constituting the openness dimensions. Openness might be relevant to psychological functioning in the context of China opening up to the global community in the wake of its economic elaboration. Adopt the combined ethic and emic approach as in the original CPAI to develop the openness-related scales to identify the descriptors of all behaviors used to characterize people who would be open to ideas, experience, and relationships. For the 4 CPAI normal personality factors, 4 of the 6 newly added openness-related scales, novelty, diversity, divergent thinking, and aesthetics, joined with the 3 scales on the previous social potency factor, extroversion, leadership, logical and affective orientation, to form an expanded, expansive social potency factor. The enterprise scale and another openness-related scale, interpersonal tolerance, have secondary loading greater than 0.4 on this factor. We also conducted a joint factor analysis between CPAI2 and NELPIR. We found that we used the 28 CPAI personality scales and the 15 NELFFI such scales were jointly analyzed by principal axis factor analysis with a very max notation. We found the factor loading pattern of factor 2 is basically the same openness factor found in the 5-factor solution. The NELFFI openness indicators and the CPAI2 social potency factor scales, diversity, aesthetics, divergent thinking, and local versus affective orientation, and novelty, and loaded positively on this scale. The CPAI2 social potency factor scale, leadership, which loads primarily on the openness factor in the 5-factor solution, has a secondary loading on this factor. The CPAI2 dependability scale, enterprise, also has a secondary loading on this factor. The openness factor explained 8.9% of variance. This may be indicated. We also can find the openness factor in Chinese population, but it's very different from the openness in the Big Five or in the Western populations. For this openness in the Chinese factor in Chinese society, The five-factor structure did not provide a clear structure that separated openness as an independent factor. Instead, its new openness-related skills aligned with the original structure of CPAI to form a more interpretable personality taxonomy in the Chinese context. The four intellectually related open skills, novelty, diversity, divergent thinking, and aesthetics, loaded on the expanded social potency expansiveness factor that characterized dynamic and charismatic leaders. The loading of interpersonal tolerance and on the accommodation factor, and the loading of the social sensitivity on the IR factor illustrated the interpersonal aspects of the openness in the collectivistic cultures. Beyond those characterizing the individual's internal aspects of openness in individualistic cultures. So this may be reflect there are two typical openness. One is for the interpersonal aspects of openness. The other is for the interpersonal aspects of openness. This table is for a summary our study based on the joint analysis, CPAI 1 and Big 5, CPAI 2 and Big 5, and CPAI 2 and Big 5. Generally, we can find these six typical factors in Chinese. One is combined based from neuroticism and dependability. The second is combined from conscientiousness and dependability. The third is agreeableness and accommodation. The fourth is for the extroversion and social potential or expansiveness. The last two factors are very different from the Western, the Big Five model. The AR factor is very culturally relevant in Chinese population. It includes, for example, this factor includes traditionalism and modernity, harmony, discipline, relationship orientation, we call it Renqing, thrift extroverance. For the openness, maybe there are some subscales in openness in Big Five, but we also found some very Chinese-specific factors. For example, divergent thinking, diversity, aesthetics, novelty is very different from the Western people's openness. There are some validation evidence for the openness scale in Chinese populations. We can find the CPAI's openness scale is significantly correlated with some behaviors. For example, music categories, non-major field study, magazines regularly read, web browsers variety, online chat program variety, and other things. We also found the IR factor have some very important contribution for explaining Chinese behaviors. For example, life satisfaction, social beliefs, trust and pleasures tactics, career choice efficacy, leadership, job performance, psychopathology. We also use the CPAI found some validation evidence. CPAI's factor can explain Chinese adolescents' life satisfaction, health behaviors, trauma and resilience, career self-efficacy, and vocational interest or identity. So therefore, we can think our personality research in this globalization or globalized situation. Firstly, because we found a culturally relevant factor of IR, so maybe we can, of course, we can absolutely we can think personality development is culturally relevant. That means when we consider or research the personality, we have to consider cultures. Even there are some universal dimensions, but some maybe some culturally relevant dimension also very important to explain people's behavior, because every people is lived in a specific cultures. But from another perspective, based on the multicultural or globalization, or maybe people's personality also have been shaped in this multicultural situation. For example, maybe we can say openness is openness in Chinese population. In China population is this kind of factors, because it's because it's multicultural background, it proves Chinese people develop or highlight their openness aspects in their personality. So we can conclude that if we try to understand Chinese people, Big Five maybe is important, but IR also is important, and the openness is maybe sometimes it's different from Big Five's openness. It's a Chinese openness. Okay, thank you very much.